Don and Jean had lived in the house next to that mansion for 5 decades, 50 years watching the oak boards rot, and neighbors cross the street to avoid what everyone called the stain of 4th Avenue. The entire town believed that place hid the shame of a traitor. But today the bulldozers arrived. The government gave orders to reduce history to dust before sunset. While the neighborhood applauded the end of the old mansion, Don, an 82-year-old veteran who'd learned to read danger in silence, looked at Jean and said, "They're not coming to clean up the town. They're coming to hide what the past still has to say." Without looking back, the couple crossed the rusted gate for the first time in 50 years. They expected to find dust and betrayal. But when Don forced open the attic door and the flashlight beam illuminated an impeccable military file and a letter with the army seal addressed to the father he'd never known, his heart stopped. What Don and Jean had just discovered wasn't a ruin. It was proof that the person the town had hated for half a century was actually the one who'd saved them all from a betrayal no one imagined. If you've ever been judged without a chance to defend yourself, if you've seen truth buried for convenience, if you've ever needed courage to challenge what everyone believed, this story is for you. Prepare to see the moment when 50 years of lies crumble before the courage of a couple who refused to let truth be demolished along with bricks. Subscribe now, because what Don finds in that attic will make you believe it's never too late to rewrite history. This is Dreams Don't Age. Donald Carter was 82 years old and had learned long ago that the loudest voices in a room were rarely the ones telling the truth. He stood at his living room window on the morning of June 15, 2025, watching the crowd gather across the street with their phones raised, filming the arrival of 3 massive bulldozers painted in municipal yellow. The machines rumbled down 4th Avenue like mechanical dinosaurs, their treads leaving marks on the old asphalt, their diesel engines making the windows of Don's modest house vibrate with each idle rev. The crowd was growing by the minute. Neighbors who'd lived on this street for decades, curious teenagers filming everything for social media, local reporters setting up cameras to document what the mayor had called a historic moment for Riverside's revitalization. Everyone seemed excited, relieved even, to finally see the end of the eyesore that had haunted their neighborhood for half a century. Behind Don, Jean, his wife of 58 years, stood with her arms crossed over her cardigan, her 80-year-old face showing the same skeptical expression she'd worn when the mayor had announced this demolition 2 months ago at the contentious town hall meeting. Don had been there that night, sitting quietly in the back row while Mayor Richard Morrison had stood at the podium, explaining why the condemned property at 412 4th Avenue needed to be demolished immediately for public safety. "They're actually going through with it," Jean said quietly, her voice carrying the slight tremor that had developed over the past few years. "I didn't think they would. Not this quickly." "They have to move fast," Don replied, his voice still carrying that gravelly tone from too many years, breathing too much smoke and dust in places most people only saw on news reports. "That house is the last witness to something they can't afford to have examined. The longer it stands, the more chance someone might actually look inside." The mansion across the street, officially designated as 412 4th Avenue, but known to everyone in Riverside, North Carolina simply as the Hayes Place, or more commonly, that traitor's house, had been abandoned for exactly 50 years. Don knew the precise timeline because he'd been living next door in his modest 2-story when Colonel William Hayes had disappeared without explanation in 1975, and he'd watched the house slowly decay from a stately Victorian manor, with wraparound porches and ornate trim, into what now looked like something from a horror movie set. The transformation had been dramatic and thorough. The paint had peeled away in long strips, exposing grey, weathered wood underneath. The wraparound porch sagged dangerously in the middle, several boards visibly rotted through. Multiple windows were broken, some boarded up with plywood that had itself rotted and fallen away over the decades. Vines had claimed the eastern wall completely, their tendrils working into cracks in the foundation with destructive persistence. The roof showed multiple areas of obvious damage, with missing shingles and what appeared to be structural sagging. The front yard had become an overgrown jungle of weeds and volunteer trees that had sprouted and grown wild. And yet, despite 5 decades of obvious neglect, despite the complete absence of any maintenance, despite weather and time and vandalism and decay, the house still stood, still fundamentally solid, still refusing to collapse even though by all rights it should have fallen years ago. The town had hated that house for as long as Don could remember living next to it. Not just disliked it or found it unsightly, genuinely, viscerally hated it, with the kind of emotion usually reserved for living enemies. People crossed the street rather than walk past it on the sidewalk. Parents warned their children in serious tones to stay away from the traitor's house and never ever go inside. Teenagers periodically spray-painted obscenities on the walls. Though the graffiti never seemed to stick properly, the paint would run and fade within weeks, as if the house itself rejected the vandalism. And every town council meeting for the past 20 years had included at least one impassioned citizen, demanding that the dangerous eyesore be torn down for public safety and community dignity. The official story was simple, consistent, and had been repeated so many times over 5 decades that it had calcified into accepted historical fact that nobody questioned. Colonel William Hayes, retired military intelligence officer and former analyst, had been discovered in 1975 to be selling classified information to foreign powers. Before he could be formally arrested and tried for treason, he disappeared, abandoning his home and leaving behind unpaid debts and civic disgrace. The military had quietly buried the investigation to avoid creating a public scandal that would damage national security, but everyone in Riverside knew the real truth through unofficial channels and persistent local gossip. The Hayes Mansion was a monument to betrayal and treason, and its continued existence was an insult to every patriotic American, especially to the veterans who'd served their country honorably. Don had never believed a single word of it, not for one moment, in 50 years. Not because he had concrete evidence to the contrary, he didn't, or at least he hadn't until this morning, but because of something that had happened in 1968, 57 years ago, when Don had been a young private of 25, scared and inexperienced, deployed to Vietnam and assigned to a patrol that had walked straight into a carefully planned ambush in dense jungle terrain. Half his unit had been cut down in the first 30 seconds of overwhelming enemy fire. Don had taken shrapnel fragments in his left leg and lower back, had been pinned behind a fallen tree, bleeding heavily and unable to move, listening to the screams of dying men around him, and certain he was going to die there in the mud thousands of miles from home. And then Colonel William Hayes had appeared like something from a fevered dream. He'd been running a classified intelligence operation in the area, had heard the firefight from his position, and had personally led a small team on an unauthorized rescue mission that saved Don's life and the lives of 3 other critically wounded soldiers. Hayes had carried Don over his shoulder through hostile territory for over 2 miles, had gotten him to a medevac helicopter, had quite literally saved his life through extraordinary courage and complete disregard for his own safety. Don had tried desperately to thank him, to ask his name so he could properly acknowledge his savior, but Hayes had just pressed a finger firmly to his lips and shaken his head with absolute intensity. This operation didn't happen, Private. I was never here in this area. You never saw me. Operational security, you understand? Never mention this to anyone. Don had understood. Military intelligence operations were classified at levels he couldn't comprehend. Hayes couldn't be acknowledged publicly. So Don had kept the secret faithfully for 57 years. He'd never told Jean, never told his children when they were born, never told anyone about the extraordinary man who'd saved his life at tremendous personal risk. And when Hayes had disappeared in 1975 and been branded publicly as a traitor who'd sold secrets to America's enemies, Don had been torn apart inside, knowing with absolute certainty that the accusation was false, but unable to speak the truth without violating operational security and potentially endangering others. For 50 years, Don had watched that house slowly decay across the street and had thought about Hayes constantly. Where had he gone? Why had he disappeared so completely? Was he still alive somewhere? And most importantly, most urgently, what had really happened in 1975 to make a genuine hero disappear and accept the label of traitor without defending himself. Now, on this June morning in 2025, watching bulldozers position themselves strategically around the mansion while the crowd cheered and filmed, Don realized with sudden crystalline clarity that he was witnessing a cover-up in active progress. "They're not just tearing down an abandoned house," he said to Jean, turning away from the window with sudden decision hardening his expression. "They're destroying evidence. This whole thing is about making sure nobody ever looks inside." Jean looked at him with the patient, knowing expression of someone who'd spent nearly 6 decades learning to read her husband's moods and recognize when he'd made an important decision. "Evidence of what exactly?" "I don't know specifically," Don admitted, his military training making him precise even in uncertainty. "But I know with absolute certainty that William Hayes was no traitor, and I know that house has stood empty and untouched for 50 years. 50 years, Jean. And in all that time nobody has been allowed inside for any reason. Every attempt to sell it has been blocked by mysterious legal complications. Every proposal to renovate it or turn it into a historical site has been rejected by the town council. The property has been in a kind of legal limbo for half a century, with the town making sure nobody can access it. And now suddenly they have 3 bulldozers and a rush order to demolish it in a single afternoon, before anyone can object or delay. "You think there's something inside they're trying to hide," John said. It wasn't a question, but a statement of understanding. "I think there's something inside that someone very powerful desperately doesn't want found," Don corrected carefully. "And once those bulldozers start working, whatever evidence or truth exists will be buried in rubble and hauled away to a landfill, and the truth will be permanently destroyed." Jean was quiet for a long moment, studying her husband with those sharp blue eyes that had first captivated him in 1965 when they'd met at a church social. Then she walked decisively to the front closet, pulled out her practical coat and tossed Don his worn jacket. "Then we'd better get inside that house before they start the demolition," she said, with the calm practicality that had characterized their entire marriage. "We need to see what they're so desperate to hide." Don stared at his wife of 58 years, momentarily stunned by her immediate acceptance and support. "John, that's breaking and entering. Criminal trespass at minimum. We're 82 and 80 years old. We could get arrested, potentially face charges. They're going to demolish it anyway in the next few hours," Jean pointed out with impeccable logic. "The building will be gone regardless. What's the worst they can realistically do to us? Arrest 2 octogenarians for trespassing in a house that's going to be rubble by sunset? By the time any criminal charges could possibly be processed through the system, the house will already be completely destroyed and gone. And if there's something inside worth hiding desperately enough to rush this demolition, someone with courage needs to find it before it's permanently lost to history." Don felt his heart rate increase for the first time in years, that old familiar feeling from his military days when a dangerous but necessary mission was about to begin. Jean was absolutely right. This was their only realistic chance, their last possible opportunity. After 50 years of watching and waiting and wondering and carrying the burden of silence, this was the moment when they could finally learn the truth about what had really happened. "The back door through the alley," he said, making the tactical decision quickly. "There's less visibility from the crowd if we approach from behind. We go immediately, right now, before the demolition officially starts. Once we're inside, the crowd won't be able to see us, and the bulldozer operators won't start until they've properly confirmed the building is completely empty." "Then let's go now," Jean said, already moving toward their back door with surprising speed for someone 80 years old. And just like that, after 50 years of living quietly next door to an unsolved mystery, after decades of painful silence about a hero falsely accused, Donald and Jean Carter became criminal trespassers in the house that had haunted their neighborhood and their conscience for half a century. The alley behind 4th Avenue was overgrown with aggressive weeds and littered with the accumulated trash and debris of decades of neglect. Don and Jean moved as quickly as 2 people in their 80s could reasonably manage, which meant carefully and deliberately with frequent pauses for balance and breath. Don's left leg, where he'd taken shrapnel 57 years ago, ached with the old familiar pain that never completely disappeared. But adrenaline was a powerful thing, even at 82, and he pushed through the discomfort with practiced determination. The crowd noise from the front street was loud enough to cover their movement completely, dozens of people talking and laughing and filming the impending demolition, like it was entertainment, like they were about to witness something historic rather than the destruction of evidence. The back door of the Hayes mansion was exactly as decrepit-looking as the front facade, paint peeled away in long strips, wood visibly weathered and grey, the frame slightly twisted from decades of settling and environmental stress. But when Don tested the door carefully, pressing against it experimentally, he found it locked with a deadbolt that felt surprisingly firm and solid despite the apparent decay surrounding it. Locked, he reported to Jean quietly. After 50 years of abandonment, still properly locked with a mechanism that feels maintained. Can you open it? Jean asked practically. Don pulled out his wallet and extracted a small metal tool he'd carried since Vietnam, a lockpick he'd been taught to use during special operations training, and had never quite brought himself to throw away, despite Jean's periodic suggestions that he clean out his wallet. His fingers weren't as nimble or steady as they'd been at 25, arthritis making fine motor control more challenging, but muscle memory was a remarkably powerful thing. After 3 minutes of careful work, feeling for the pins and tumblers with decades-old skill, the deadbolt clicked open with a satisfying sound. The door swung inward with a prolonged groan of protesting hinges that hadn't moved in decades, and a wave of musty air rushed out into the alley, carrying the smell of old wood and accumulated dust, and something else, something that reminded Don powerfully of military storage facilities, the distinctive scent of preservatives and carefully controlled environments designed to protect important materials. They stepped across the threshold together and carefully closed the door behind them, cutting off the outside noise and plunging themselves into the peculiar silence of a house that hadn't been inhabited in half a century. The interior of the mansion was dark, the boarded and covered windows blocking most natural daylight from entering. Don pulled out a small LED flashlight he'd grabbed from his junk drawer, a habit from military service always carrying a light source, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the gloom to reveal a scene that made absolutely no sense whatsoever, given what they'd expected to find. The house should have been utterly destroyed inside after 50 years of complete abandonment. 5 decades without maintenance or care should have meant collapsed ceilings, rotted floors, extensive water damage, animal nests throughout, vegetation growing through cracks and broken windows. Nature should have reclaimed this space thoroughly and completely, reducing it to a shell. Instead, they were standing in what looked like a carefully preserved museum or time capsule. The hardwood floor beneath their feet was covered in thick dust, but remained solid and intact. The walls were still straight and true, covered in faded but undamaged wallpaper. Furniture sat exactly where it had been left decades ago. A sofa, matching chairs, side tables, all covered in white protective sheets that were dusty but not rotted or torn. The crystal chandelier overhead was completely intact, its hundreds of crystals catching Don's flashlight beam and throwing tiny rainbow patterns across the walls. "This doesn't make any sense at all," Jean whispered, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the absolute silence. "This house should be completely destroyed inside, reduced to rot and collapse, but it looks like someone just walked out yesterday afternoon and forgot to dust before leaving." Don moved deeper into the house cautiously, his flashlight beam revealing room after room in impossible states of preservation. The formal dining room's table was still set with china plates and silverware. The library shelves were packed with hundreds of books that looked old, but showed no signs of water damage or deterioration. A grand piano in the parlor still had sheet music open on its stand, the pages yellowed but intact. Every room told the same impossible story, perfect preservation disguised by surface dust. The decay is entirely theatrical, Don realized with growing certainty, his analytical mind piecing together the evidence. The outside appearance, all that rot, the peeling paint, the sagging porch, the broken windows, it's all deliberately staged. Hayes must have used chemicals and artificial aging techniques to make this house look abandoned and dangerous to keep people away. But inside he maintained it perfectly. He was living here, or at least using it as an operational base. But why? Jean asked the crucial question. What was he protecting that required this level of deception for 50 years? Don had no immediate answer. He moved through the ground floor systematically, examining everything with the trained observational eye of someone who'd been taught to recognize patterns and anomalies in intelligence work. And slowly, methodically, a disturbing picture began to emerge from the details. This wasn't just a house that had been preserved. It was a secure facility, expertly disguised as a deteriorating residential building. Every window had internal steel shutters carefully hidden behind the wooden boards. The doors were reinforced with metal plates concealed under the decorative wood facing. The walls were noticeably thicker than standard residential construction, suggesting soundproofing or additional shielding. The basement door was steel, not wood, despite its wooden exterior. Hayes was running a covert operation from this location, Don said with growing certainty. After he disappeared in 1975, he didn't actually leave Riverside. He went underground, literally hiding in his own home, using the house as a secure base for continued intelligence work. The whole town thought he'd fled, but he was here the entire time, living in secret and continuing whatever mission he'd been conducting. But what mission? Jean repeated, her practical mind demanding specifics. And where is he now? If he was here for 50 years, what happened to him? They found crucial answers on the second floor, in what had clearly been Hayes's private study and operational center. The large room was dominated by a massive oak desk, its surface covered in neat stacks of file folders and papers, arranged with military precision. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, all locked but clearly full of documents. On the wall behind the desk hung a military medal in a frame, the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the highest military honors awarded for extraordinary heroism. And next to the medal, a photograph. Don's breath caught audibly in his throat when he saw it clearly. The photograph showed a group of soldiers in Vietnam, young men covered in mud and exhaustion, but grinning despite obvious hardship. Don recognized himself immediately, impossibly young at 25, standing with his unit before the ambush. And standing at the very edge of the frame, partially turned away from the camera as if deliberately avoiding being photographed too clearly, was Colonel William Hayes. "That's you," Jean said softly, stepping closer to examine the faded photograph with wonder. "In Vietnam. You've never shown me any photos from back then. You always said you didn't have any." "I didn't have any," Don said, his voice rough with unexpected emotion. "I lost everything in the ambush, my pack, my personal items, everything. But Hayes kept this photo. He kept a picture of the men he saved, including me. After 50 years, he still had it displayed on his wall. You were there," Jean realized, the full significance hitting her. "When Hayes saved those soldiers during that classified operation, that was your unit. That was you he carried to safety." Don had kept the secret faithfully for 57 years, never breaking operational security, never violating the trust Hayes had placed in him. But here, standing in this preserved room next to his wife of nearly 6 decades, facing evidence of Hayes's continued vigilance and sacrifice, the secret felt both necessary to finally share and impossible to keep holding inside any longer. "He carried me out of that jungle on his back," Don said quietly, each word heavy with long-suppressed emotion. "I was 25 years old, wounded and bleeding, certain I was going to die in that mud, and he saved my life at tremendous risk to himself and his classified mission. He told me I could never tell anyone that the operation was classified at the highest levels, and any acknowledgement would compromise national security, so I never did tell anyone. Not you, not our children, not anyone. And when they branded him a traitor 7 years later, when the whole town turned against him, I couldn't defend him publicly because I wasn't supposed to know he existed or what he'd done." Jean took his weathered hand in hers, her 80-year-old fingers lacing through his 82-year-old ones with the familiar comfort of nearly 6 decades together. "Then let's find out what really happened," she said with quiet determination. "He saved your life. The absolute least we can do is discover the truth and clear his name, even if it's 50 years too late." They turned their attention to the papers and files meticulously organized on the desk. Don's hands were shaking slightly, from age, emotion, or anticipation he couldn't tell, as he picked up the first manila file folder, opened it carefully, and began to read the contents that would unravel 50 years of carefully maintained lies. The files on William Hayes's desk told a story that made Don's blood run cold despite the stuffy warmth of the sealed house. Hayes hadn't been a traitor at all. He'd been a dedicated intelligence analyst working for Army intelligence, and in 1974-1975, he'd uncovered something that had put his life in immediate and severe danger. The documents were extraordinarily detailed and meticulously organized, showing the methodical mind of a trained intelligence professional. Hayes had discovered that a group of local politicians and prominent businessmen in Riverside had been systematically embezzling federal funds intended specifically for veteran services and community development programs. Millions of dollars had been stolen over the course of nearly a decade, cleverly funneled through shell companies, fake contractors, and fraudulent service agreements, systematically enriching a small group of powerful men while the community deteriorated and veterans who desperately needed services went without care. But the conspiracy went much deeper than simple financial corruption. Hayes had discovered through his investigation that some of these men had established connections to organized crime syndicates, and that they were using Riverside's strategic geographic location as a regional hub for moving illicit goods, laundered money, and other criminal activities. The town's position and the corrupt local government provided perfect cover and protection for these operations. When Hayes had started investigating these connections, when he'd begun systematically compiling documentary evidence and building a prosecutable case, the conspirators had realized he represented an existential threat to their entire operation. They'd used their extensive connections within the military bureaucracy, connections Hayes meticulously documented, to have him falsely branded as a traitor selling secrets, knowing the stigma and accusations would completely destroy his credibility before he could expose their criminal enterprise. They'd forced him to disappear, to abandon his public life and go into hiding, while they deliberately spread elaborate lies about him selling classified information to foreign powers. But Hayes hadn't run away to save himself. He'd gone underground, quite literally hiding in his own home, continuing his investigation with even greater dedication and compiling an exhaustive documentary record. For 50 years, he'd lived in secret in this house, watching the town through carefully hidden observation points, documenting the continued corruption, gathering evidence, and preparing comprehensive files for the day when someone trustworthy might finally discover the truth. "Look at this," Jean said, her voice tight with controlled anger, as she held up a document that made Don's hands clench involuntarily into fists. It was a meticulously researched family tree, showing relationships and inheritances across 3 generations. The original conspirators from 1974-1975 were listed at the top with dates and documented roles, names Don vaguely recognized from old Riverside politics and business. And branching down from those names in careful detail were their direct descendants, their children and grandchildren, and now great-grandchildren, many of whom currently held positions of significant power and influence in present-day Riverside. Mayor Richard Morrison, grandson of James Morrison, the ringleader who'd orchestrated the original embezzlement scheme. Police Chief Thomas Blackwell, son of Howard Blackwell, the accountant who'd created the shell companies and hidden the stolen money. District Attorney Sarah Chen, granddaughter of Margaret Chen, the lawyer who'd provided legal cover and blocked investigations. All of them were directly descended from the original conspirators. All of them had inherited not just wealth and social position, but almost certainly knowledge of the crimes their ancestors had committed and continued to benefit from. They know, Don said, the realization settling over him like ice water. They know exactly what their parents and grandparents did. They know Hayes was completely innocent, and they've been actively maintaining the lies for 50 years to protect their own inherited positions and wealth and reputations. And now they're demolishing this house to permanently destroy the evidence, Jean finished, her voice hardening with determination, before anyone can find these documents and expose the truth. But there was even more devastating evidence waiting to be discovered. In a locked drawer of the desk, which Don picked open carefully with his decades-old skills, they found a steel document box sealed with evidence tape that had yellowed significantly with age. Don broke the seal with careful reverence, opened the secure box, and found 3 items inside that made his heart stop completely, and tears spring immediately to his eyes. The first item was a complete military service record for Private First Class James Robert Carter, Don's father, a man he'd barely known. Don had been only 3 years old when his father had been killed in action in Vietnam in 1968. He'd grown up with only scattered fragments of information about the man, a handful of faded photographs his mother had kept, and the vague official knowledge that his father had died heroically in combat. The military had never provided detailed information, saying only that PFC Carter had been killed in action and had died serving his country with honor. Now, holding his father's complete and detailed service record in his trembling 82-year-old hands, Don learned the full truth his mother had never known, and he'd never been told. His father hadn't just died in generic combat. He'd been killed specifically during the exact same operation where Hayes had saved Don's life. The ambush that had wounded Don so severely had also killed his father. They'd been serving in the same unit. Though Don had never made that connection before, he'd been too young, too new to the unit, and the chaos and trauma of combat had made it impossible to know everyone. His father had died providing covering fire, deliberately drawing enemy attention to himself to allow wounded soldiers, including his own son, to be evacuated to safety. He'd given his own life knowing that his sacrifice might save others, including the son he'd never see grow up. Hayes had known this terrible truth. Hayes had carried Don to safety while knowing that Don's father had just been killed in the same firefight. And Hayes had kept Don's father's service record carefully, had preserved it for 57 years, had protected this evidence of heroism while waiting for the day when Don might finally discover it. The second item in the secure box was a letter, written in his father's distinctive handwriting on military stationery, addressed simply, "To my son, Donald. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're old enough to understand what I need to tell you. I'm writing this the night before a very dangerous operation, the kind of mission where you write letters to loved ones just in case you don't come back. I want you to know that I love you more than words can possibly express. I want you to know that serving our country, protecting people like you and your mother, defending freedom, this is the most important and meaningful thing I'll ever do with my life. If something happens to me tomorrow, if I don't come home, I need you to promise me something important. Don't waste your life being consumed by anger or bitterness. Don't let my death make you afraid to serve others, to sacrifice for what's right, to stand up for principles even when it's difficult or dangerous. So I've known Colonel Hayes for 2 years now, and he's the finest officer I've ever had the privilege of serving under. If anything happens to me, if you're ever in serious trouble or need help, find him. He'll help you. He's a good man, a genuine hero, the kind of man I hope and pray you'll become. Be brave, son. Be kind to others. Be the man your mother and I know you can be. Make us proud. I love you always and forever, your dad." Don read the letter 3 times with vision blurred by tears. He hadn't cried in decades. Decades of suppressed grief and loss finally breaking through. His father had written these words the night before the ambush that killed him, had known the operation was extraordinarily dangerous, had thought of his 3-year-old son and taken precious time to write these words of love and guidance and hope. And Hayes had kept this letter safe for 57 years, had preserved it carefully, had waited patiently for the day when Don might finally find it and know his father's last thoughts. The third item in the box was a formal military citation document, signed by multiple high-ranking officers, officially recommending Private First Class James Robert Carter posthumously for the Silver Star Medal for extraordinary valor in combat. The citation described in precise detail how Don's father had provided sustained covering fire under heavy enemy assault, how he'd refused to retreat to safety even when his position was being overrun, how he'd fought with exceptional courage until his last breath to protect his fellow soldiers and enable their evacuation. The citation had been written and properly signed, but had never been officially filed or processed. Someone with authority had deliberately buried it, suppressed it, prevented Don's father from receiving the recognition and honor he'd earned through ultimate sacrifice, and Don understood immediately why this had happened. Hayes had written a brief note attached to the citation, dated 1975. They're suppressing this medal recommendation to punish me for documenting their crimes. James Carter died a genuine hero, and they're deliberately denying him official recognition because I was his commanding officer, and they want to hurt me. I'm keeping this safe and protected until the truth can finally come out and he can receive the honor he earned and deserves. James deserves so much better than this. His son deserves to know the complete truth. Don stood in that dusty study, 82 years old, holding his father's final letter and learning for the first time the complete story of how his father had died protecting others. Learning that his father had been an authentic hero, learning that Hayes had carried the burden of this knowledge for decades, had protected these precious documents, had waited patiently for this exact moment. "Don," Jean said gently, her hand warm on his arm, "we need to move quickly now. We don't have much time left before they start the demolition. We need to gather as much evidence as we possibly can." Don pulled himself together with considerable effort, carefully placing his father's letter and the medal citation in his jacket pocket where they'd be safe. Then he began systematically gathering the most incriminating documents from the desk, the files detailing the conspiracy, the family trees showing current officials' connections to the original criminals, the evidence of corruption spanning 50 years. But there was far too much to carry, hundreds of documents, thousands of pages of meticulously compiled evidence. They needed everything, but they couldn't possibly move it all before the bulldozers started. "What about Hayes himself?" Jean asked the question they'd both been avoiding. "Where is he? Is he still alive somewhere?" They found the final answer in the attic, accessed by a narrow staircase that required careful climbing. The attic had been converted into modest living quarters. A simple cot, a small table, shelves stocked with preserved supplies. And on the table, written in increasingly shaky handwriting that showed advancing age and illness, they found Hayes's final message dated December 2024, just 6 months ago. "If you're reading this, I'm finally gone. Cancer, if you're curious. Lived to be 94 years old and died on my own terms, so I consider that a victory over the people who tried to kill me 50 years ago. I couldn't expose the truth while I was alive. They would have destroyed all the evidence and eliminated me before I could speak publicly. But now I'm done playing their game. Everything you need is here in this house. All the evidence, all the proof, all the documentation. This house will keep it safe and protected until someone genuinely brave and honorable comes looking for truth. I hope desperately that it's someone who understands what honor and service really mean. Someone who knows that truth matters more than personal comfort or safety. Someone like the men I had the privilege of serving with. If you're reading this, don't let them bury the truth again. James Carter's son deserves to finally know his father was a hero. Riverside deserves to know it's been systematically lied to for half a century. And I deserve to stop being remembered as a traitor when I spent my entire life serving with honor. Finish what I started. Godspeed and good luck, Colonel William Hayes, United States Army Intelligence, retired. Don stood absolutely still in that cramped attic, reading Hayes's final words. The extraordinary man who'd saved his life had died just 6 months ago, alone in this hidden space, taking his last breath in the same house where he'd spent 50 years protecting truth and waiting patiently for justice. He waited his entire life, Don said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He waited 50 years for someone brave enough to find this evidence and expose the truth. And he died still waiting, still hoping, never knowing if anyone would ever discover what he'd preserved. "But we found it," Jean said with absolute determination. "We're here now, and we're not going to let his 50 years of sacrifice be for nothing." Outside, they heard the distinctive sound of diesel engines revving higher. The bulldozers were preparing to begin their work. They had minutes remaining at most. Don looked at his wife of 58 years, at the overwhelming evidence scattered around them, at the truth that was about to be buried forever under rubble unless they acted immediately and decisively. And he made a decision that simultaneously terrified and exhilarated him. "Call 911 right now," he told Jean firmly. "Tell them there are people currently inside the building, and the demolition needs to stop immediately. That'll buy us maybe 30 minutes before they can verify and proceed." "And what are you going to do in 30 minutes?" Jean asked, already pulling out her cell phone. Don picked up Hayes's Distinguished Service Cross Medal from the wall with reverent care. He picked up his father's Silver Star citation and the letter. He gathered as many crucial documents as his arms could physically hold. "I'm going to walk out that front door," he said with calm determination. "I'm going to stand directly in front of those bulldozers where everyone can see me, and I'm going to make every single person in this town listen to the truth they've been avoiding for 50 years. Donald Carter emerged from the front door of 412 4th Avenue at exactly 2:47 p.m., stepping onto the sagging porch that had terrified neighborhood children for half a century. The crowd that had been laughing and filming enthusiastically fell into shocked, confused silence. As an 82-year-old man they all recognized, the quiet veteran who'd lived next door seemingly forever, appeared from inside the supposedly empty, haunted house, carrying a substantial armload of papers and wearing 2 military medals prominently displayed on his chest. The 3 bulldozer operators immediately killed their engines, utterly confused by this completely unexpected development. Mayor Richard Morrison, who'd been giving enthusiastic interviews to local media about this historic moment of civic revitalization, turned visibly pale as he saw Don walking steadily and deliberately down the porch steps toward the massive yellow machines. "Stop that man immediately," Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "He's trespassing. Someone call the police and arrest him right now." But Don kept walking with steady purpose, moving through the crowd that parted uncertainly before him until he stood directly in front of the lead bulldozer in a position where he couldn't be ignored. He carefully set his substantial stack of papers down on the warm hood of the machine, then turned to face the crowd, the mayor, the reporters, and the dozens of cameras that were now all pointed directly at him. "My name is Donald Carter," he said, his voice carrying with the natural authority of someone who'd once given orders under fire. "I'm 82 years old. I'm a decorated veteran. I've lived next door to this house for exactly 50 years, and I'm here to tell all of you that absolutely everything you believe about Colonel William Hayes and this house is a complete and deliberate lie." Morrison desperately tried to interrupt. "Mr. Carter, you're clearly confused and disoriented. You need medical attention. Someone please—" "I'm not confused." Don's voice cracked like a whip, instantly silencing the mayor and commanding complete attention. "I'm probably thinking more clearly than I have in 50 years. And I'm going to tell every single person here exactly what happened in 1975 and why this house is being demolished so urgently today." He picked up the first document from his stack with steady hands. "This is a classified military intelligence file compiled by Colonel William Hayes over a period of years. It comprehensively documents a massive conspiracy involving local politicians and businessmen who systematically embezzled millions of dollars in federal funds specifically intended for veteran services and community development. The money was stolen between 1965 and 1975, cleverly funneled through fake companies and fraudulent contracts that Hayes meticulously documented. The crowd murmured with growing confusion and intrigue, phones recording everything. Don continued with increasing intensity. When Hayes discovered this criminal enterprise and began compiling prosecutable evidence, the conspirators used their extensive connections to falsely brand him as a traitor. They deliberately forced him to disappear and systematically spread lies about him selling secrets to foreign powers. But Hayes didn't actually run away. He went underground, hiding in this very house, and spent 50 years continuing to document the truth and gather evidence. He picked up the family tree document John had found. These are the names of the original conspirators and their specific roles, and these are their direct descendants who currently hold positions of significant power in Riverside today. Mayor Morrison's grandfather, James, was the ringleader who orchestrated everything. Police Chief Blackwell's father, Howard, was the accountant who created the shell companies and hid the stolen money. District Attorney Chen's grandmother, Margaret, provided the legal cover that blocked investigations. Morrison's face had transformed from pale to deep red, with barely controlled rage. This is absolutely insane. He's making up ridiculous conspiracy theories. Those documents are obvious forgeries created by a delusional old man. Then why are you so desperate to demolish this house immediately? Don challenged directly, his penetrating gaze fixed on the mayor. If Hayes was just a crazy traitor, why not allow professional historians to examine the building? Why rush to destroy it? Why specifically today? Why this urgent timeline? Why before anyone can possibly look inside and verify anything? He pulled out his father's letter, his hands visibly shaking now as he held it up for the crowd to see. My father, Private First Class James Robert Carter, died in combat in Vietnam in 1968. I was 3 years old. The military told my mother only that he died heroically in action, but never provided any specific details. I learned today, just 2 hours ago, that my father died protecting his unit during a devastating ambush. The same ambush where Colonel William Hayes personally saved my life by carrying me to safety while I was wounded and bleeding. The crowd gasped audibly. Several people in the front were visibly crying. Don continued, his voice now thick with profound emotion, but remaining steady. Hayes carried me out of that jungle over his shoulder, through 2 miles of hostile territory. I was 25 years old, wounded, and certain I was going to die, and he risked everything to save my life. My father died providing the covering fire that allowed me and others to be evacuated. He gave his life knowing his sacrifice might save his own son. And Hayes kept my father's letter to me, kept his medal citation, kept it all protected and safe for 57 years, waiting for me to finally find it and know the truth. He held up the Silver Star citation with trembling hands. My father earned this medal through extraordinary valor and ultimate sacrifice, but it was deliberately suppressed, never officially filed, never processed. Because Hayes was being systematically punished for documenting corruption, they took away my father's recognition to hurt the man who documented their crimes and saved my life. Tears were streaming freely down Don's weathered 82-year-old face now, but his voice remained clear and strong. Colonel William Hayes died 6 months ago. He died completely alone in that house, still protecting the truth, still hoping desperately that someone would find the evidence before it was destroyed. He died branded publicly as a traitor by a town he'd tried to save from corruption, and today, right now, his life's work and his evidence are about to be bulldozed into rubble because powerful people want to keep protecting lies their grandparents told 50 years ago. He looked directly at Mayor Morrison with unwavering intensity. You knew all along. You've always known Hayes was completely innocent. You inherited your wealth and position directly from your grandfather's crimes, and you've been deliberately protecting that corrupt legacy your entire life. And now you're trying to destroy the last evidence before anyone can examine it and expose the truth. Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but Don cut him off sharply. I'm 82 years old. I'm a decorated combat veteran. I've kept quiet for 50 years because I thought I had to for operational security, but I'm done being silent. So I'm done watching truth be buried. This house doesn't get demolished, not today, not until every single document inside has been thoroughly examined by independent federal authorities, not until Colonel Hayes's name is completely cleared and my father gets the recognition he earned through sacrifice. He turned to address the entire crowd directly. If you have any genuine respect for truth, for honor, for the men who actually served this country with integrity, you'll support me right now. If you have any shame about passively accepting lies for 50 years, you'll demand real answers. And if you have any courage at all, any at all, you'll stand with me right here and stop these bulldozers until the truth can be properly investigated. For a long, tense moment, absolutely nothing happened. The crowd stood frozen, uncertain. Then Jean emerged from the house, carrying even more documents, and stood firmly beside her husband. Then an elderly man from the crowd, another veteran, Don recognized him from VFW meetings, stepped forward decisively and stood next to them. Then another person. And another. Within 5 minutes, more than 50 people had formed a human barrier between the bulldozers and the house, while the rest of the crowd continued filming everything and posting frantically to social media with the viral speed of modern technology. Mayor Morrison desperately tried to order the police to forcibly clear the crowd, but Police Chief Blackwell, perhaps suddenly realizing his own family's complicity was about to be comprehensively exposed, refused the order entirely. Within an hour, news vans from regional stations had arrived on scene. Within 2 hours, state authorities were present and taking control. Within 4 hours, federal investigators were on site, beginning to examine Hayes's meticulously compiled documents. And by sunset, when the bulldozers should have reduced the house to rubble and buried all evidence forever, 412 4th Avenue still stood, damaged and aged but proudly defiant, its secrets finally being brought into the light after half a century of enforced darkness. 6 months after Don and Jean had crossed that rusted gate and changed everything, on a cold December morning, a completely different kind of crowd gathered at 412 4th Avenue. The house had been fully restored now, its Victorian beauty finally reclaimed after 50 years of theatrical decay. The rot had been removed carefully by historic preservation experts, revealing that Hayes had deliberately applied chemical treatments to make the wood appear damaged while actually preserving it underneath. The structure had been fundamentally solid all along, just like the man who'd hidden within it. The house was now officially designated the Colonel William Hayes Memorial and Veterans Resource Center, funded substantially by recovered embezzled funds and donations from across the country after Don's confrontation had gone viral and captured national attention. The investigation that followed had been absolutely devastating for Riverside's political establishment. Mayor Morrison had resigned within 1 week, facing serious federal criminal charges. Police Chief Blackwell had followed shortly after. District Attorney Chen had been removed from office. Dozens of prominent families in Riverside had been exposed as having directly inherited wealth stolen from veteran services and community development funds over decades. Some of that money had been recovered through legal action and was being used now to actually help veterans 50 years too late. Hayes's name had been officially cleared by the Department of Defense with a formal public apology. His body had been located, he'd arranged his own quiet burial under an assumed name, and had been reinterred with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. And Private First Class James Robert Carter had finally, 57 years after his death, been awarded the Silver Star posthumously. Don had accepted the medal on behalf of his father at an emotional ceremony that had reduced him to tears. Now, at the dedication ceremony for the memorial, Don and Jean stood together on the beautifully restored porch as the assembled crowd applauded enthusiastically. Don was wearing both his father's Silver Star and Hayes's Distinguished Service Cross. The hero's widow had contacted Don personally and insisted he have it, saying Hayes would have wanted the man he saved to carry his legacy forward. "I spent 50 years living next door to this house," Don said into the microphone, his 82-year-old voice steady and clear, wondering what was inside. 50 years watching it decay and knowing something was fundamentally wrong but not having the courage to challenge what everyone believed. I'm grateful beyond words that I finally found that courage, even if it took until I was 82 years old to discover it. He looked at Jean, standing beside him as she'd stood faithfully for 58 years. My wife gave me that courage, She's the one who said we should cross that gate. She's the one who refused to let truth be buried forever. This memorial exists because an 80-year-old woman decided that doing what's right matters infinitely more than doing what's safe or convenient. Gene squeezed his hand, smiling. Don continued. Colonel Hayes spent 50 years protecting the truth, waiting patiently for someone to find it. My father gave his life protecting his fellow soldiers and his own son. Both of them were genuine heroes who deserved recognition and honor. Both of them were denied it because of systematic lies, deliberate corruption, and moral cowardice. He looked out at the crowd, at the veterans who'd gathered from across the region, at the young people who'd come to learn this hidden history. We built this memorial not just to honor Hayes and my father specifically, but to remind everyone that truth matters fundamentally. That courage doesn't retire when you turn 65 or 70 or 82. That sometimes the single most important thing you can do is stand directly in front of a bulldozer and refuse to let history be erased by people who benefit from lies. He paused, then added with quiet intensity, if you've ever known something was wrong but stayed silent because speaking up was difficult, if you've ever watched injustice happen and told yourself it wasn't your responsibility, if you've ever wondered whether one person can actually make a meaningful difference, I'm here to tell you they absolutely can. Jean and I were just two elderly people who lived next door to a mystery for 50 years, but we chose courage over comfort. We chose truth over convenience, and we helped clear the names of men who'd been waiting half a century for justice. The crowd's applause was thunderous. Jean stepped to the microphone, speaking publicly for one of the rare times in her life. My husband is too modest, she said with a slight smile. He makes it sound like we carefully planned everything, like we were naturally brave. The truth is, we were absolutely terrified. We're 80 and 82 years old. We broke into a house that was about to be demolished. We could have been arrested, injured, or much worse, but we did it anyway, because sometimes being terrified and doing it anyway is what courage actually looks like in real life. She looked at Don with obvious love. 58 years ago, I married a man who'd learned in Vietnam that standing up for what's right sometimes means standing completely alone. I've watched him struggle for decades with keeping Hayes' secret, watched him carry the pain of knowing a hero was being called a traitor. I'm proud beyond words that we finally got to tell the truth. I'm grateful that our last act of courage got to be together. The memorial was officially opened, its doors thrown wide to welcome veterans who needed services, researchers who wanted to study Hayes' comprehensive documents, and visitors who wanted to understand this previously hidden chapter of American history. Don and Jean gave tours personally that first week, showing people the carefully preserved interior, the study where Hayes had worked tirelessly for 50 years, the attic where he'd spent his final years. They showed visitors the photograph of young soldiers in Vietnam, pointing out both 25-year-old Don and his father visible in the background. They explained patiently how 50 years of systematic lies had finally crumbled because two elderly people had decided truth mattered more than personal safety or comfort. On Christmas Eve 2025, Don stood alone in Hayes' old study, now preserved as a museum exhibit, looking at his father's framed letter hanging prominently on the wall where thousands of people could read it. I found him, Dad, Don said quietly, to the memory of a father he'd barely known. I found Colonel Hayes like you told me to. I cleared his name the way you would have wanted, and I made absolutely sure you got the recognition you earned through ultimate sacrifice. He touched the silver star pinned carefully to his jacket. I wish desperately I'd had more time with you. I wish I'd known you as more than photographs and stories, but I'm grateful for your letter. I'm grateful you knew Hayes and trusted him, and I'm grateful I finally got to finish what you started, standing up for truth even when it's extraordinarily difficult. Behind him, Jean appeared quietly in the doorway. Ready to go home? Yeah, Don said, turning away from the letter with a peaceful smile. Let's go home. They walked out together, through the house that had kept its profound secrets for 50 years, past the crowds of people who'd come specifically to learn the truth that had almost been permanently buried. And as they crossed back to their own modest house, the home they'd lived in for 50 years, Right next door to a mystery that had defined their neighborhood, Don felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: complete peace. The kind of peace that comes from finally doing what you know is absolutely right, regardless of how long it takes, or how difficult it becomes, or how old you are when the moment finally arrives. If this story moved you deeply, if you understand that courage and truth and honor don't retire at 65 or 70 or 82, leave one word in the comments that describes what you would fight for if you knew something was being buried unfairly. Because Don and Jean's story proves something that everyone in this community knows instinctively. Age doesn't diminish our fundamental obligation to do what's right. Sometimes the most important stand we take happens long after the world expects us to sit down quietly and stop causing trouble. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to speak truth to power, never too late to stand up for what genuinely matters, never too late to be the hero your younger self would admire and respect. This is the family of people who know that the best time to do the right thing was yesterday, but the second best time is today, no matter how many decades have passed since yesterday.